As you see here on the left, we have Mein Kampf again. I'm going to go to the same pages that we went to before, page 66 and 67. So as you see people who say that Jews are a race, the thing that was very clear from reading Mein Kampf was Hitler considered them to be a mixed race. And it says right here on 66 and going into 67, in the course of the centuries, their external appearance had become European and human. Yes, I even looked upon them as Germans. So Hitler is saying it took basically 200 years for their external appearance to become European. Now, when he says European, that's interesting because European encompasses a whole range of different features. And he's saying of all European features, it took them 200 years to become European, to get those features, meaning they did not have the appearance of Europeans, which is a group of people whom he considers to be what? White. And he says their appearance was European and human. So he's basically saying the people who look human to him are people who look European. And in essence, you can read this or decipher this as being, okay, well, apparently if he didn't think they looked European and he didn't think they looked human, they must have looked very different than Europeans over the centuries ago before they mixed, right? And how do you know that he's talking about people who mix? And how do you know that it's not just, well, he's just delusional? Well, he says it right here. It says, Jews were, he thought, a race mixed with other races too diverse in character to permit assimilation. He thought, well, these guys look so different that there's no way they're going to be able to look European. Especially not German, which he said they looked German to me and they looked European. Can't believe it. Hence, that's why he marked them with a yellow star. So this is something that Hitler believed, guys. Jews were, he thought, a race mixed with other races, diverse in character to permit assimilation. Now, I want to go ahead and do this. I'm going to play something for you that's very interesting. But before I get into that, let's stick to this thought that Hitler thought that these people looked very different than Europeans. Here on the right, I have something that I found. I looked up something where they're talking about kind of Egypt, and I guess the Greeks used to call Egypt something else. So I looked up that reference and I found this very old book, right? And so in this book, it's talking about Ethiopians, right? And it's talking about Herodotus, and it says the mention of two sorts of Ethiopians in Xerxes' army. He says the Eastern, who were of Asia and reckoned among the Indians, from whom they differed only in hair and language. So he said they differed only in hair and language. The Ethiopians of Africa with frizzled black hair, and he said those of Asia had very long hair. So that's what he's talking about, right? And he's referring to, mentions of Cush and the sons of Ham and all that kind of stuff, which people are considered to be what? Dark skin. He goes over here and he starts to talk about a character that we know in the Bible. He talks about Candace, and Candace was the queen of the Ethiopian eunuch, who was a very high level eunuch who believed the gospel in the scriptures. So he talks about this Ethiopian, and then we go down here and they talk about what? He talks about Abyssinia signifies properly a mix of diverse nations settled together, comprehending the Abyssinians, the Nubians, and the Pongians. So when it talks about the Abyssinians, the Nubians, and the Pongians, well, we know what, quote unquote, the Ethiopians look like, but it's talking about this other group, which are the Nubians. If we look here for the Nubians, we can get a sense of what they look like. These are what the Nubians look like, okay? These are what the Nubians look like. So these are the Nubians. That's the portrayal of the Nubians. So the Nubians also were a pyramid culture. In fact, the way that the Nile works is the Nile kind of ran upwards. When you look at a map, think of it as going upward. So lower Egypt is actually up because they're saying that's at the end of the Nile River that ran into the sea. So this is basically these Nile Valley or Nile River civilizations, okay? Now, as we keep going, he talks about, we know they're talking about Ethiopians, and we know we have Nubians. So Ethiopians, Nubians is talking about, in reflection, is talking about, or Cush. So it's kind of referring to that whole area there. But then it talks about, when we get down to the Abyssinians, and it talks about their different groups, Abyssinians, Nubians, and Pongians. And it talks about how the Arabs have given them a name, which the Ethiopians actually rejected. They call themselves Ethiopians, and their country, the Kingdom of Ethiopia, okay? And so then we keep going down, guys, and it talks about the Abyssinians, which was part of that confederation or diverse groups. It says the Abyssinians are what? Black. It says it right here. The Abyssinians are black or olive colored according to the different provinces which they inhabited. So the Abyssinians, the Abyssinians are what? Black or olive colored. Because remember, we're talking about they're a diverse mixture of people together. And so he's saying the Abyssinians are black or olive colored according to the different provinces which they inhabited. It says, if transplanted into Europe, this group of people, they became white at the second or third generation. So he's saying these people who are black or olive colored, he says they became white at the second or third, depending on how dark you were. It took the second or third generation for you to become white. So we have an example right there. Now, going back to Mein Kampf, where he says Jews were, he thought, a race mixed with other races, too diverse in character to permit assimilation. Well, that explains it. Too diverse in character to permit assimilation is because when you look at these people, well, we're having people who look like this. But these are Nile Valley civilizations, right? These are people who built pyramids. These are people who have their own structures, their own stuff. But see, this is the thing. We've been lied to so badly that we don't understand that, Egyptians looked different. There's different color skinned people within Egypt of all variants. So what they like to do when they show you stuff, they'll like a relief. I've seen it where they'll just include the Egypts conquered Nubia, and then they'll show you a Nubian that looks a certain way with a very specific, what they consider to be stereotypical features. That's how they'll do it. But when you look at this, this is supposed to be Nubian, and the Nubians are portraying themselves as having a diversity of skin color, as we just read about, guys. When it talked about Abyssinians, and you have people who are darker who have this hairdo, people who are mid-range darker who have this hairdo, but you also have this person here, up here at the top, who's kind of a lighter brown who has this hairdo, and then you have a person who's darker, and then you have a person who's medium brown, and then darker brown, and medium and darker brown, and then you have a person right here is light and dark, light and really dark, right? So you have these people who are reflecting their culture. They're not tripping. Look at the person down here, at the bottom, right? These are people who are varied. You got people who are dark. You have people who are lighter. You have people who this person actually looks like they could be Caucasian. I can't really tell. They look like they could be Caucasian, from what I can tell, some of these people. But anyway, my whole point is there's this diversity of culture, but it would be considered what? Predominantly what? Black. That's what they would consider it. All this, this is just, people have different cultures, guys. You've traveled probably, I've traveled. If you've gone to these different places around the world, you see that, people have talent and skills and they're able to do stuff. Now, to make sure this video doesn't turn too long, we see that Hitler was talking about these people became light over centuries. But the thing that's interesting as we see this, we say, wait a minute. This kind of supports what he was saying, because he says the Abyssinians are black or olive colored. And he talks about, according to the provinces which they inhabited. And he says, if transplanted into Europe, they became white at the second or third generation. That's really not that long. To become white at the second or third generation, that means it didn't take that long. Now, where Zionism ends up screwing up, because they want to say Jews are a race, what they're doing is they're trying to do the bait and switch. They're saying, well, Jews are a race, and they're saying, well, they just happen to look white, but you don't understand the complexity of whiteness. Now, what they're not telling you is, because they don't think you're going to go and read Mein Kampf is they're not telling you actually no, you're lying. You're just trying to do the bait and switch and make the Jews white so you can actually support white supremacy along the lines of Nazism, but pretending to say, well, these people aren't white, they're Semitic. Don't be anti-Semitic, which in translation, when you actually understand what they're trying to do, they're saying don't be anti-chosen race, which happens to look white. So if the chosen race are white, and they're saying, well, don't be anti-Semitic, using the Holocaust as a reason for you not to be able to criticize anything, then they've just done the bait and switch, right? They've gotten you to say, well, I don't want to be against these people because, yeah, they may look white, but they're not really white. And obviously, that's why Hitler killed 6 million, right? And so that's the way to kind of get you to shut up. The problem is if they were honest, they wouldn't say they were a chosen race. They'd say they were a chosen mixed race, just based on what Hitler said. But even then, you'd say, well, if they're a chosen mixed race, which only appeared to look European after 200 years, that means they should actually be much, much darker. And the people who you should gather in that land, if you're going to call it a race, should be much, much darker. Now, why is this important? It's important because if they're lying about Egypt and they're lying about the image of Egypt, then that's why they don't want to have things like this. This is highly problematic for them. And that's also why, though, when you look and you say, well, look at what they're doing for the tombs, they've changed them. So if you go to a tomb, for instance, this is an Egyptian tomb, but this tomb was 4,400 years old. Let me show you this. This is a 4,400-year-old tomb unveiled in Egypt. So this is before they could get in there and touch it up, do a little Photoshop with it. This is showing a tomb in Egypt. Now let's do this. Let's go ahead and pull this over here. Now, they always like to do these bait and switch tricks, but this on the left is Nubia. This on the right is Egypt. Now, if we go through, the reason why I'm putting it here is because you can see the color of this guy's skin, right? It's a brown. It's the same brown skin that you can see in some of the other. I mean, it's a little close up, so it's a little different. And plus, they're using the different back texture, but color back texture. But it's the same. You have the same brown skins here. In fact, you have some people in Nubia who have lighter skin than some of the people on the Egyptian tombs. But these are supposed to be the Nubians. And then you have another guy here. They're showing diversity of texture who's lighter here. But wait a minute. Look at this person down here, guys. Right here in this area. This person has darker skin, medium skin, darker skin. So there's something that's really fishy about what these guys are doing. Let's go back. There's one picture here that I like to pause on because it's always a good sideshow here. This one. Look at this. I mean, again, some of these people in here, if you were to transport these people out of this picture, put them in this picture, you would not be like, oh, well, these are different color people. You wouldn't say that. You'd say, well, there's people in here who fit some of the mixed brown people who are in this picture. Africa is a diverse country, but we just saw people who look medium brown like this, darker brown like this, and lighter brown like this. Some of the people in this picture match this tan color, right? So my whole point to show you this is just to show you that people play games. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to show you why this is problematic for Zionists and why they're lying about the Bible. We go into the Bible, and the reason why I went through all this stuff is I just wanted to show you again. This is the 2020 census for the United States government. Just to show you how much this stuff is still in play, how these guys are still doing the same tricks and trying to make Jew a race, which it's not. It's a belief. It's a faith. Anyone can believe it. Anyone can be converted. That's the whole point of it. And it's not for political, geopolitical, worldly gain. It's for you to believe to have eternal life, right? So what they've done, as you can see here in the category, white. Now, we just talked about what? Abyssinia. And we just saw that in Abyssinia, they said they're comprised of Nubians, obviously Ethiopians, and they were close to where? Egypt, which explains when you look at Nubia, which is actually what? Nubia is below Egypt. And that explains why Nubia has people ranging from, darker and a little bit lighter and darker, just a mix of people, right? Because a lot of Nubians intermarried in with what? Egyptians. And a lot of Ethiopians intermarried with Egyptians. That's just the way it is. People in proximity, they married each other, right? But what you see here is you see Egyptians as classified as white. They did that for a reason. Now, you say, well, man, is that a political thing, and is that still going on now? Yes. What I want to show you now is I want to show you this. I'm trying to make this really efficient. This guy is an Egyptian, right? You can look this up. It's on YouTube. I am black and Egyptian, right? I am black and Egyptian, not white, okay? So I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to go ahead and play it, and you can listen to this guy and listen to his story.
Neighborhood, I called the police, and I was told by the director of general education, who is retired now, in '88, I was told by him that I get people angry when I say that I'm black Egyptian.
Why is he getting people angry when he says he's black Egyptian, guys? Why? Think about that. Why would people be black? Why would people be angry because he says he's black Egyptian? Because they're looking at the Bible narrative and they're saying, well, wait a minute. I don't want you to be black Egyptian because I grew up going to so-called Sunday school, and I've been listening to stories. I've been sitting in the synagogue. I've been going wherever, the church, the synagogue, or wherever. And all of these guys are telling me how, Moses was a white man played by Charleston Heston, and Elizabeth Taylor is playing like, an Egyptian. And so this upsets people. And then I also heard that the chosen people were in bondage in Israel, and they've heard all these stories, and because they've identified it as being a race instead of it being a faith, their whole identity is predicated on that being true. Even though many of the people who believe these lies, they're only being duped by the elitist, Pharisaical elitist class who are propagating these lies because they're so greedy and concerned with this world that they don't. These people are like antichrist. They're anti-messiahs. That's why they're teaching people. No, you're a race and a faith, which is getting them to do what? Focus on their flesh. Focus on this world. Focus on politics. Fight amongst themselves. Kill, steal, pay taxes to have war, because they have this little game being played, the 3-card Monty, or the 3-hat religions, which are fake and phony, which they call what, quote unquote, so-called Judaism, so-called Christianity, and so-called Islam, right? And instead of it being one Lord, one faith, one baptism, we all been baptized by one Spirit into one body. A spirit going into the body is telling you is not, when it says we've been baptized by one Spirit into one body, it's basically saying the seed. Like the Spirit represents the Word of God, is saying the parable is just the seed is the Word of God, right? You sow into the flesh, you shall the flesh reap corruption. You sow into the Spirit, you shall the Spirit reap life everlasting. So each produces after its kind. So basically it's saying that it's a spiritual birth. And that's why the Bible says, they that be of faith, these are the children of Abraham. Okay? Now, this guy is an Egyptian. Listen to what he says.
If I just say that I'm Egyptian, I would get along. I have to add that I was denied promotion twice because I chose black classification. This is part of my 2 lawsuits against my employer, which are currently pending. 2 lawsuits.
Now, just for the education of our viewership, why don't you share with us a breakdown of Egypt as it is today, insofar as blacks or combinations thereof of European descent and what have you?
We don't have Egyptians of European descent in Egypt. We have a population which is basically...
See, he just says we don't have a European descent in Egypt. So this goes into the Hitler thing, right? All this stuff. See, Hitler, you may not know this, but Hitler was tied into the Catholic Church. So a lot of people don't understand this kind of stuff. And I'll play more about this and you'll be sort of shocked. Hold on.
The which is basically a mixture of ancient Egyptian blacks who intermarried with Arabs right after the Arab conquest. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black before the Arab conquest. But before the Arab conquest came the Greeks. it was ancient. The ancient Egyptian population was in Egypt for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black, and the Greeks came in 300 BC, and they started to intermarry with the local population, and then the Romans came and ruled from 70 BC until they were conquered by the Arabs and kicked out by the Arabs in the 7th century. And these people intermarried with the Egyptian Copts, and they made the pigmentation of the Egyptians, the Copts, much lighter because of this intermarriage with Europeans.
Now, you're an educator, okay? Now, how do you deal with situations when you practice your profession insofar as dealing with the mythology or the misconceptions about Egypt being a white civilization? How do you deal with that?
This is a big problem because Egypt, the ancient Egyptian civilization was a black civilization, and ancient Egyptians were black according to the Greek scholars and the Roman scholars. Ancient Egypt became white only in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And the scholar who is responsible for this is Seligman, the noted anthropologist from England, Seligman. White supremacy argues that blacks are inferior than white intellectually. They are subhuman and they are incapable of building a civilization. White supremacy had one dilemma until Seligman came. The dilemma was ancient Egypt was black according to the Greek and the Roman scholars. 10 of them said that, including Aristotle and Plato. 10 of them said that.
So they had one issue. The issue was that the Greek scholars, these people, the Greek, that's why I went and looked up the Greek name for Egypt. And it said the problem that they had was Egypt was black. And actually what happens, guys, if you look at a certain reference of books pertaining to Egypt, go to Internet Archive, before a certain time when they're writing about Egypt, you can maybe get some hints, but they're really just saying, oh, they're black or they're this or the blah, blah, blah. And they'll just say, you know, oh, they're Ethiopians. And it seems like it's more of a scholarship. But obviously there seems to be this push, this drive to say, no, that can't be the case. Right? That can't be the case. And as you can tell that someone behind the scenes said, no, we need to justify conquering people and saying that God is our justification for doing it. And so that's when you have this kind of this pseudo 3 Abrahamic faiths things come up, and where they're saying, okay, we're going to say that we're going to invent a place called the so-called Middle East, which didn't even exist. And they're just talking about that because they're trying to say from a biblical standpoint, oh, the East and the West, and they'll merge together, you know, East and West. And then the chosen race will rule from what? From Jerusalem, right? That's what they're trying to do. That's ultimately what they're trying to do. But it's kind of this Hegelian dialectic where they're, you know, causing war and breaking down countries and pitting countries against each other under the guise that it's just a chosen race thing and that prophecy is being fulfilled. It's got nothing. This is not prophecy being fulfilled, guys. It's people are going to look at it and say it's prophecy, but okay, what about the prophecy of them being gathered into land and having eternal life? What happened to that part of the prophecy? So some of this stuff is so easily refutable that if you just like read the Bible and just said, okay, well, wait a minute. Jesus said to Nicodemus, unless a man be born again, he can't even see or enter the kingdom of God. And you're saying that you're his chosen people, but it says they in the flesh can't please him. How are you the apple of his eye when he says, they who be of faith, these are the seeds of children of Abraham. You don't even have faith. So a lot of it doesn't even make sense. The Bible says the children of the flesh are not the children of God. So it really, the whole thing about the flesh is just dumb in general, but especially pertaining to the skin, it's actually extra dumb. But this is the reason people believe this is because people want to believe it. They want to believe. Think about it. It's a pride thing. People want to look in the mirror and they say, well, look how great we are. You know, look at the civilization of this and that. And they're like, there's a hierarchy. You know, the blacks haven't really done anything. They never did anything. And so they look at the state of people now, and plus you think about all the history that's been erased, and they say, well, look, they've never been anything. So you're right, they're not fit to rule. That's why they can't have Nubia, Egypt, and any of these places. Think about it. If they know about Nubia, guys. Even if they know about the Benin Empire, they know about Nubia, they know about all these empires. But yet, there's no big push or any big exhibits talking about these empires on TV. Why not? Why not the big push? Not even on so-called Black History Month or whatever. They don't push any of this stuff. Why is that? They're literally telling you about remember the Holocaust and having these things as if that was a war that was fought in America. Why are people trying to remember a war that didn't even happen here on the so-called U.S. soil, and they're remembering and pushing that more than they're pushing the history of people who actually came here and were actually enslaved here? That makes no sense when you think about it.
That in writing, they had this dilemma. Ancient Egyptian was black. So if blacks are inferior intellectually and are incapable of building a civilization, how come the ancient Egyptians built a civilization? Seligman found the solution for this dilemma. He came up with a theory called the Hemaite Theory. He separated the blacks who built a civilization in Egypt and Ethiopia from the rest of the black race, and he called them brown-skinned whites, or the Hemites. So Seligman saved white supremacy from this dilemma, and all the white scholars followed him from that time on. This was at the end of the 19th century. And since that time, white scholarship says that ancient Egypt is white.
Mustafa Hefni.
Is that true? That white scholarship says ancient Egypt is white? Yes. Here it is right here. So they looked at like you said, the Arabs conquered Egypt, Rome conquered Egypt, all these people conquered Egypt. And what did they do? That was their way of kind of lightening up Egypt. So they they know how this works. They lightened up Egypt. And then they claimed, Egypt was never black in the first place. And then they said, well, they're kind of Middle Eastern. That's how they're Middle Eastern. They just invented a term. They're Middle Eastern. There's no Middle Eastern term in the Bible, right? And that's why they did that, because they needed to do this thing to where they can gradually transition to what color? To a light color, to a white color. Hence, that's why you have the whole thing with Hitler. And they said, well, how can we kind of do this okie doke where we just kind of flip it and make it white? That's when they did the thing with Hitler. But the mistake that they made when they did the thing with Hitler was they said they were a mixed race with other races. And it says, look, too diverse in character to permit assimilation. Too diverse in character to permit assimilation. That kind of screwed things up a little bit, right? Because he's basically saying that the original people who they mixed race with, these people could not have looked, their external appearance didn't look European or human, because that only happened over centuries of interbreeding. Centuries, right? So that's where they really, really, really messed up. Now, you say, well, this thing with Egypt and this thing with Hitler, it's really interesting when you think about it. The thing with Hitler that happened, let me play a little bit of this here. Let's see, I'm going to prove to you and show you this whole thing with Hitler. This is a channel. This guy's pretty thing. It's called Mark Felton Productions. Kind of rare to see, but he's doing a thing on Hitler's Jewish soldiers. The reason I'm playing this is because they're going to show sort of the hierarchy and to prove to you that Hitler had this kind of thing of what percentage of you are this and that.
Adolf Hitler had made no secret of his hatred for the Jewish people. It was clearly stated that once Hitler achieved power, he would try to remove Jews from Germany, as indeed he did on becoming Chancellor in 1933, enacting not only violence and intimidation towards Jews, but also legally barring Jews from any meaningful life inside Germany, forcing hundreds of thousands to emigrate in the 1930s. The Jews were legally barred from all the professions, and then in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were promulgated, defining who was Aryan and who was not. These laws actually forbade marriage or sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews, codified as the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. These laws were later extended to include Romani and black people, and Romani in particular were held at the same level of contempt as Jews. But what about pre-existing marriages and relationships and the offspring these unions had already produced before the laws came into effect? What was the children's status? The Nazis produced a complex series of classifications to cover all possible heritage cases, and applied them without regard to families. The children of two Aryan parents were considered Deutschblütige, or German-blooded, and received Reich citizenship. Those who were 1/8 Jewish, that is, had one Jewish great-grandparent, were likewise German-blooded. There then followed the classification Mischling, or mixed race, Mischling also translating as mongrels. Mixed race at the second degree were those persons who were a quarter Jewish, having one Jewish grandparent. They could also have German citizenship. And finally, there was mixed race of the first degree, being 3/8 or half Jewish. These people would also be approved for German citizenship. Jews were defined...
Now look at that. Even if you were half and half, you were considered classified for German citizenship. That's pretty amazing, right? And this is after he said, they looked white, but I know they had changed over the course of time because of their mixing in with what? Europeans. And he said before that, though, they were too dissimilar to, what do you say? They were too dissimilar to... Centuries their external appearance have become European and human. Yes, I even looked upon them as Germans. And then he says what? He says, a race mixed with other races, diverse in character to permit assimilation. Okay, right? And so he's talking about that, and he's talking about how they were married to Arabs and Assyrians, and even before that, throughout time, they were even more mixed. So that goes along with, let's see, I'm sorry, that's not what I want. This.
As being 3/4 or wholly Jewish, and were designated as race enemies and persecuted.
So if you're 3/4, you were race enemies and persecuted. Again, this is a man who wrote, I couldn't really even tell, but it's 3/4. So that's the part when people are like, well, he had to look in the background and find out this and that. That's what the background, looking into the background, was about. Because in many cases, he couldn't tell.
Citizens had to obtain a German blood certificate proving their racial and citizenship status. In this way, some families contained German citizens and Jews, and would be split up as the persecutions ramped up into World War II, and full Jews were sent to concentration camps. So it was that many Mischlinge, men who were half or quarter Jewish, ended up in military uniform during World War II.
So there you go. So if anyone tells you, well, no Jews fought on Hitler's side, what are you going to say? They're going to tell you, oh, it's complicated. But no, you're going to say, no, you're lying. It's not complicated. This is known history. But why are people pretending not to know the history now? Seriously, why are people pretending not to know the history now? It's cut and dry. They were a distinct race. No, it's not cut and dry. It's not cut and dry. So who should go into the... See, you know what makes this stuff seem so foolish, guys? So let's go back to this. Based on Hitler's chart, right? Based on his chart, let's go look at his chart. So basically, accepted, Jude, not accepted. These two groups not accepted. 3/4 and full is not. So 75% and 100, you're not accepted, is what he's saying. 75% and 100%, quote unquote, so-called blood, you're not accepted. So think about that. Are they now doing the same thing to determine if a person can go into the land? Because technically what they should be doing is saying, well, actually, you have to be 3/4 or more to actually go into the land. But they're not doing that now, are they? So how simple is it, guys? It's not simple. It's not simple. All this gaslighting and people saying they don't, oh, you don't understand, they did this. See, because they want now we're here and they figure there's been some distance since the war. They can tell you stuff that's actually not true and just patently false. And you could actually go look it up and be like, what you're saying is actually patently false. Hitler thought that they were much darker before. He thought they were a mixed race. He said they had started to become European, and even the ones who were there, whom he couldn't tell, he put a star on. And then he decided, look, I'm going to subdivide those, and I'm going to put people who consider to be 75% or more, quote unquote, so-called Jewish blood. Those are the ones I'm going to consider Jews. The ones who are half and below, halfies and below, I'm going to consider them to be Germans. And hence, you had Jews that fought for Nazis. You had Jewish Nazis.
The children of two Aryan parents were considered Deutschblütige, or German-blooded, and received Reich citizenship.
Okay, I already played this. So I played that. Mark Felton, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. You can look it up. That's there for you to see. Okay. Now that we've done that, we want to talk about the other thing. So I was doing that because I want to underscore the whole thing of like why now they're trying to pull the okie doke, and they're trying to say, well, why this whole thing came about, the whole Hemetic hypothesis. The Hemetic hypothesis, who started the Hemetic hypothesis? How did that come about? Who was behind that? And one of the things that you can see with the Hemetic hypothesis is one of the people who started that was some guy who did it in the Talmud. This is a guy named Professor Tony Martin. You can go on Odyssey and you can look it up, the Jewish slave trade of Africans. Again, people say it's complicated, but see, I say it's not a race. If they want to say it's a race, then okay. But if they're going to say it's a race and they're a distinct race, okay. How does that work when Hitler said, okay, if you're 75% of certain blood, you're considered Jew, and if you're less than 75%, you're not? How does that work? And then, how does it work here? Because they're saying the Jewish slave trade. Did anybody check the blood to make sure that the ones who were doing the slave trade were at least 75% blood of who were included? No, they didn't. But listen.
It would be forever the hewers of wood and the drawers of water for other races. The authority for this idea was said to reside in the book of Genesis, in the story in the book of Genesis. Now, there's a story in the book of Genesis, and there's an interpretation of that story that allowed it to be used to justify African slavery, and they're two different things. The story in Genesis is in Genesis. It's been in the Bible ever since. But the sort of spin that was put on that story that enabled it to become the basis for the Hemaite myth actually comes out of the Talmud, the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Somewhere around 500 AD or thereabouts, the Babylonian Talmud. Let me just describe the difference between the story as it appears in the Bible and the story as it was spun in the Talmud. According to the Bible, Noah, after the flood, apparently had a vineyard someplace, and he partook of the wine that was produced out of his vineyard. He got himself drunk one night, went into his tent, took his clothes off, as people often do when they get drunk. And according to the biblical story, he had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham apparently entered the area where his father was lying in his drunken, naked stupor, and Ham, in an act of disrespect, gazed upon his father's nakedness. And apparently went back outside and informed his two other brothers of his father's condition. According to the biblical story, the two other brothers then came inside the tent or wherever, and out of respect to their father, they kind of backed into the tent. They would not look directly at him in his naked condition. They backed into the tent, they covered him with some kind of a garment, and according to the biblical story, when Noah revived, when he, arose from his drunken stupor and realized what had happened, he then cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his descendants forever, and said that they would be the servants of the descendants of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure how come, but somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the notion that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, and Shem was the progenitor of the Asian race, and Japheth was the progenitor of the European race. So Noah had three sons of three different races. And he cursed his African son and their descendants, and said that those descendants would be the slaves, the servants of the Asian branch of the family, and also the European branch of the family forever. And that's as far as the biblical story goes. The Talmud, which of course, my understanding of the Talmud, I'm no expert in the Talmud, but my understanding is that the Talmud consists of interpretations, what they call glosses, on various biblical stories. And these glosses or interpretations or spins are supposed to give people who subscribe to the Judaic religion a sort of an authoritative guide as to how to interpret the biblical stories and whatnot. So what the Talmud did then, the Talmud came along, the Babylonian Talmud, around about 500 or so AD, and proceeded to spin this biblical story for reasons that are unknown to me. But Ham, again, was said to be the progenitor of the African race. Now, interestingly enough, I've read someplace that early Christians also accepted this notion of Ham being some sort of progenitor of the African race. But apparently, in the Christian tradition, the kind of overtly racist implications of that fact didn't develop in the same way as it developed in the Judaic tradition. According to the Talmud, Ham was the original African, and when God, through Noah, cursed Ham and his son Canaan and all his descendants, he was in fact cursing the African race. Now, this was the unique new element of the story that the Talmud originated. That the curse on Ham and Canaan was not only a curse on an individual and his family, but it was a curse on a race. So here, this is the contribution then of the Talmud. That God, through Noah, cursed the African race. And the Talmud proceeded to embellish the story in the most delightful, should I say, ways. For example, the Talmud said that there was ample proof that God was in fact cursing the African race. It said, for example, that because Ham had gazed upon Noah's nakedness in the dark of night, that the African race was henceforth turned black. So that the blackness of the African became a sort of a visible indication of that curse. The Talmud said that because it was dark at night when Ham entered that tent and looked upon his father's nakedness, he had to open his eyes, big had to buck his eyes, as they say in America, to see his father in the darkness. And that's why Africans had big eyes. The Talmud said, and I'm going to quote all this exactly in a minute. I'm not making this up. It sounds incredible, but I'm actually paraphrasing a gentleman by the name of Harold Brackman, a man who worked until recently for the Simon Wiesenthal Center of all agencies. He wrote all of this in his dissertation. And it might not surprise you to discover that once people like myself began quoting what this guy Brackman wrote, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. And that is that Brackman denied he had ever written this stuff. This stuff is in Brackman's PhD dissertation. It's called The Ebb and Flow of History. Anybody here can easily read it. You can get it in any library. If they don't have it, they'll get it to you interlibrary loans. It's called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a PhD dissertation, I think in the history department at UCLA, 1977, by Harold V. Brackman, who I believe up to a couple of years ago, maybe even now, is or was until recently a functionary of the Simon Wiesenthal, or is it Wiesenthal Center. But despite the fact that his writings are clearly in the public record, that any undergrad student can access this stuff and check it for themselves, once the story got out, he quickly denied he'd ever written this. This man actually wrote letters to the New York Times. I believe I have the actual footnotes here in the Jewish Onslaught concerning all this. This man wrote letters to the New York Times. He wrote a slew of letters to black publications all over this country, denying all of this stuff, even though it's right there on the record. So I'm, using very good evidence here when I paraphrase what he's saying. Brackman tells us that because, and here it gets to be totally hilarious. Now, these Jewish rabbis, the sages, they call them, the wise men who put together this Talmud, they actually invented. I mean, they sort of elaborated on the biblical story. It's like a jazz musician who improvises. Well, they improvised on the story. They did a whole elaborate improvisation in the story. And somehow, Lord knows how come, but they came up with the notion that Ham, when he went into that tent and looked upon his naked father Noah, that Ham buggered his father. He had anal intercourse with his father. And because he had anal intercourse with his father, that's the reason, and here I'm citing Brackman, that's the reason why part of the curse was to give black men large sexual organs. So all of this was part of the curse. The black skin, the big eyes, even the kinky hair too, big sexual organs, all of this. So, as amazing as this may seem, this transpired 1,000 years before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade.
Guys, that's 1,000 years before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. That is incredible. 1,000 years before the slave trade, these guys in the Talmud, these specific people in the Talmud are writing this stuff, making this stuff up. So he's basically saying this is kind of the genesis, if you will, of this ideology of the Hemetic, hypothesis.
And when the slave trade came into being, this notion of the Hemetic curse was revived, and it became, both for Jews and for Christians, it became the most pervasive of all the attempts to rationalize that slave trade. Let me quote the exact words of Harold Bachman, lest you suspect that I'm making this up. I'm quoting here from Harold Bachman, the dissertation I mentioned a minute ago, The Ebb and Flow of History. Quote, "There is no denying," this is on page 34 in case anybody who has the book feels like reading along with me. I know several of you have the book on it. This is on page 34 in the middle of the page, second new paragraph. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source," and listen to how unequivocal he is here. It was the first, the very first. In other words, this is Bachman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center acknowledging that the Talmud was the place that invented this story of the Hematic curse. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic content into the episode." Here he is referring to the episode of Ham looking upon his father's nakedness. He goes on to suggest that these early sages, some of them, impose this homosexual sort of spin onto the story. Quote, he says, Rab is one of these sages. He says, Rab maintained that Ham had unmanned Noah. So Ham, according to this sage, had actually castrated his father. While Samuel is some other sage, Samuel claimed that he had buggered him as well. Both unmanned him and buggered him. Now, how this arose out of the biblical story, I'll never understand. Let me continue to quote from Bachman here in his dissertation. Quote, he is discussing here various slightly diverging, variants of this myth. He goes on to say, quote, "The more important version of the myth," that's the Hematic myth, however, "ingeniously ties in the origins of blackness and of other real and imagined Negroid traits with Noah's curse itself. According to it," that's according to this most popular version of the Hematic myth, "according to it, Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly." This is in the Talmud. "Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes." So if you ever wondered about the origin of the kinky hair and the red eyes of black folk, here you have it. "Because your lips jested at my exposure, theirs shall swell." That's why black folks have thick lips. "And because you neglected my nakedness, they, that is your children, the children of Ham and Canaan, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see." So they have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to Africa. So the Hematic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade. Okay. Some years after the Babylonian Talmud, sometime in the Middle Ages, a man who I believe they consider to be perhaps one of the greatest philosophers ever, a man by the name of Maimonides, actually also contributed to that notion of Africans being subhuman when in his famous book, Guide to the Perplexed, when he, Maimonides, suggested, again, that African people were less than human, that they were somewhere between monkeys and human beings. This is Maimonides, a man who is one of the most revered of all of these Jewish sages. So by the time...
So there you go. So you have this history, guys. Maimonides, I hear people quoting Maimonides now. You're like, where did all this stuff come from? Where is this stuff? Why is there this push to try to promote certain things within the so-called black community? Well, when you think about it, people are trying to promote these things to point out and draw out other people's sinfulness so that they can seem less sinful and justified. Because what they're trying to do is you're trying to basically make the prophecy come true. They're literally trying to make the prophecy come true. So if because he just said, like, this is something that was adopted by quote unquote so-called Christians and so-called Jews, right? And I say so-called because I'm just like, there's just basically some greedy people behind this who are promoting this, and people who want to believe it are believing it and following along. This is literally a religion. This whole idea of racism, it's actually a religion. Racism is a religion. It really is. It's because it's you're projecting on the people something from the outside, and you're assuming that you can see everything about them on the inside. But what they're doing is they're just using that to justify their theft. They're using it so they can be like, well, God is behind me and doing all this stuff. That's essentially what they're doing. It's pretty sad. Now with that, he talked about sort of slavery, and he talked about the how it started. We're going to go now to this. This is going to be kind of key because it's talking about this guy. Now this guy, again, he's wearing the kippah, and I think this guy too considers himself to be Jewish. I can't really tell. That's the whole thing. You got to wear the hat. I can't tell, guys. So he's going to ask this guy about slave trade. It says Jewish slave owners of Jamaica, and he's going to get into it.
So what is the dynamic in play with Jews and slavery in Jamaica?
Yeah, so this is obviously a huge aspect of what I write about, and the reason I write about this so much is because it was a very conspicuous aspect of the wills. Yeah. As I was reading the wills, you find that slave populations are being bequeathed en masse, and in that they're being named individually, and also you see a lot of evidence, sometimes very direct and articulate, of concubinage or sexual relationships with women of color, both enslaved and free, and then incorporating their children to some extent into the family through voluntary inheritance. So that all made me realize that we need to address the issue of Jewish slave ownership. Over time, I've also realized that this has been the subject of competing tendencies. One coming from an anti-Jewish position like the Nation of Islam that wanted to make the case that Jews were overly represented in the slave trade and were overly abusive to slaves. And that's not true. In fact, it's kind of puzzling why Jews weren't more involved in the slave trade, since it was a totally open type of endeavor that had no guilds.
So what you have here is you have a man who is trying to, again, Jew is not a race. So, but since you believe it's a race, that allows you to kind of practice racism, right? Let's face it. Some people are just saying it's okay if I practice a subtle form of racism. That's all they're saying. I believe I'm the so-called chosen race and God's given me this mission. So that allows you to say, well, I didn't elect myself. God chose me. What are we going to do? God chose us. What are you going to do? I can't help it. And well, how do I know God chose you? Well, look at the suffering. Look at the suffering we've suffered. But in doing that, you always have to do what? You always have to one-up everybody else in their suffering, right? So that's why you have this group in the background that actually is, anytime they want to make anti-Semitism, they can actually make anti-Semitism, right? Think about it. Anytime you're like, oh, something else is getting a lot of attention. Well, okay, let's bring out a anti-Semitic person to say something crazy. And you can just make it. And it's like, okay, someone said something anti-Semitic, but there's people who are living in squalor and dying and getting murdered every day, but you're ignoring all these people right in your backyard. But you're talking about, well, somebody said something that offended me on a talk show. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, guys, it's actually insane. But he's basically saying what he knows. Again, this is a person, and it's good that he's doing this. He's a person who just started looking into it because he had the question and he heard all the accusations. And what probably happened is like, I'm hearing all these accusations about so-called Jews and the slave trade, and I want to go and look it up. I'm going to put this to bed because this is not true. I know it's a lie, right? And so you see this guy on the right. I mean, look at his face throughout the whole interview, guys. It's something else. He's like, you can tell he's like shocked. Like, what?
Or protections like that. And Jews owned slaves to the same extent that everybody else did. So there were no particularities. Now, this stands in contrast to a rival kind of mentality where Jews must have treated their slaves better. Because how could you be sitting at a Passover Seder saying we were once slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt while being served by slaves? But people did that. Yeah. And so some scholars reached an apologetic conclusion in the 20th century saying that Jews manumitted their slaves more readily or treated them better. And I find that no...
So how could you do that? You're slaves in Egypt yourself, right? That's what they're trying to say. And the problem, again, this is Nubia, and this is a mix of people in Nubia. This is Egypt, and I don't think you're going to pass for Egyptian anytime soon, right? So that's what the problem with the story is, guys. It's highly problematic. The whole story is problematic. So it's basically what you have here is you have people who've been lied to. They've been told a story by these Pharisees who want to use people. And they're basically just rich elite people telling a story, lying to people, getting them to go along with something, and hiding behind them and this identity to do stuff, using them as an excuse. Oh, the people died in World War II. Well, who was behind that? Who funded that? I don't know. I wonder how that happened. I don't really know. Well, could you explain to us this? Could you explain how there's 6 million being reported over time? Look, if we go to here and we're like, May 7th, 1920.
It's page 11 that I want. There we go. Page 11. Page 11. The article is called "The Jewish War Aid Gets $100,000 Gift." There it is. The fund for Jewish war sufferers in Central and Eastern Europe, where 6 million face horrifying conditions of famine, disease, and death, was enriched yesterday by a contribution of $100,000.
So there you have. Suffers in Central Eastern Europe, where 6 million face horrifying conditions of famine. 6 million. This is in 1920. You got to ask yourself. Now you know this just basically means that Hitler was duped. Hitler was partly duped, because I'm sure he thought he was doing what he was, someone kind of figured he was supposed to do. Here you're going to hear it say 6 million Jews, one half of the Jewish people throughout the world, are being persecuted and hounded. What year is this one?
Since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish people have had no darker page in their history than that which the Russian government is writing today. 6 million Jews, one half of the Jewish people throughout the world, are being persecuted, hounded, humiliated, tortured, starved. Thousands of them have been slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands of Jews, old men, women and children, are being driven mercilessly from town to town. There it is, people. 6 million Jews. One half of the Jewish people throughout the world are being persecuted, hounded, humiliated, tortured and starved. As I go along here, support you as well. Dear brethren, have mercy on the 6 million Jews in Russia and take our part. Again, 6 million Jews in Russia. 6 million. This is an article entitled "Horrors Worse in Kishinev Charged Against Russia Today." That's in the Sun of New York, Sunday, June the 6th, 1915.
So that's 1915. So the reason I'm showing you this is because I just want you to understand, guys, this isn't some little thing. This isn't some little misunderstanding. The Holocaust was planned, and it's pretty obvious what the purpose was of the Holocaust. This is all based on the Hemetic hypothesis, and these guys are determined to use that in the false religions, the three-hat false Abrahamic faith bait and switch religions, to carry out their agenda. And, this whole world lies in wickedness, guys, and darkness. This whole world lies in wickedness and darkness. And if you learn all this stuff and you got confidence in man at this point, I don't know what to say to you. I really don't. If you're like, well, I know I'm finding out a lot of news and they lied to me, but it's all good. I still don't want to believe. Like, okay. It's like when you find out all this stuff is a lie and you're still like, okay, I'm going to believe the idea of a chosen race. You're just foolish.
Whole position is really captures the truth. So in fact, I crunched the numbers in my wills, and I found that slaves were about 11 times more likely to be bequeathed than they were to be freed by Jews. So it's very uncommon to actually free manumit slaves. And there are cases of Jewish abuse of slaves.
So he's sitting there, he's talking about, well, I don't know where this happened. The reason why I played the other guy in the other video is because I want you to see how I want you to see that where it came from. He talked about Maimonides. He talked about this other guy. He talked about the early Talmud, how they kind of perpetuated or incited this kind of thing, where it's talked about the race and the curse, and that was what everyone leveraged and looked upon. So that happened 1,000 years before the Atlantic slave trade, and then obviously happened before the Berlin Conference. But that just gave people a license, right? And again, before that, they were talking about how, we saw the other thing with the other guy who was the Egyptian. And he said, the Greeks had written that they knew that what the Egyptians looked like, and they had they knew it at early, and it wasn't this big deal, but they kind of had a problem when they looked at the Bible, and they said, well, if this is true, then and we want to make ourselves a chosen race, and we've been telling our kids all these lies because they don't interpret the Bible spiritually, they interpret it carnally, then they're like, but we want to be the chosen people. They don't understand that everybody is rejected and everyone has the opportunity to believe the gospel, and they can believe and get eternal life and come into the kingdom. But since they love this world, it's like, well, there's not enough riches for everybody, so we're going to fight and kill people for it. That's basically what's going on. I feel what's going on.
And then there are plenty of cases of manumissions. In one case, he manumits a Jewish slave owner manumits his quote-unquote mulatto son because of the love and affection he has for him. So there are cases of sort of sentimentality as well. But Jews are like everybody else.
Right.
There are some abusive slave owners, and there are some that own slaves because that's what's done in the colony that they live in. Yeah.
So if it's the case that Jews were more or less following the same patterns as anyone else living in that area, is it your understanding that that's the same case for the Jewish North in North America and the Jewish South in North America, that essentially they operate no different than those in the region?
Yeah, I think that's where we are in the scholarship on this issue right now. And there's some new scholarship coming out, especially focused on Suriname, where Jews had a whole plantation community of their own, autonomous Jewish plantation village called Yodin Savannah, where they enslaved thousands of Africans. So there's been a lot of new research, and I think where we are writ large is that the Jews show no particularity in their slave ownership than anybody else. And that's true in the American South as well. And there were, proportionally to the numbers, because there were more Jews living in the North at the time of the Civil War, but proportionately there was as much support for the Southern cause among Jews as there were for as there was for the cause of the North. And ironically,
so that's a big thing, right? So you have the slave trade. You have so-called Jews participating in the slave trade in the North and the South, right along with quote-unquote so-called the white folks, supposed. And I don't understand how that works, guys. You have certain Jews that are participating were soldiers in Germany. They were soldiers in Germany, meaning there were Jews who killed other Jews based on their definition of who a Jew is. So you have Jews, quote unquote, in Nazi Jews, and you got slave-holding Jews, but then they're trying to tell you they're a distinctive race, and then Hitler's like, no, actually you're not a distinctive race. That's why I was trying to categorize you. And that's what the whole point of the star was, is that you weren't, and actually you just became a lot lighter, and you were doing this miscegenation thing. And I didn't want you guys mixing in with the white folks. I want, if you're stay where you were. You're darker people. Just stay dark. Don't try. But now they're doing the bait and switch and saying, no, they're not a mixed race group people. They're actually white. So now they're using this term anti-Semitic to hide the actual white supremacy. Which you can tell the white supremacy is just started from somebody who made the faith a race. That makes sense that they make the faith a race based on the Talmud. They made it a race. And then they're using that. They're just as greedy as anyone else, and they're using that. And that's why the whole tie into the government. And then that's why people are like, well, anytime you say something, well, it's a great conspiracy. Everything's a great conspiracy, right? It's crazy, guys. Everything's a great conspiracy. Let's see. Everything's a great conspiracy. And here you have what? What do you have Trump doing? Trump signs an order to provoke the identity crisis. And it talks about how he did this thing where Trump, what he did was he signed an order that made Judaism a race. Right? Right? He made Judaism a race. Right? Because he said, we're tired. He says, anti-Semitic tropes. So you have this thing where you can see this whole thing. And he said, Presner was in Chicago at the denomination biennial convention, along with 5 1,000 other rabbis and Reform Jews when Trump announced the order. Right? We have people here who are born Jewish and not. Black, brown, white, Asian people. People with Muslim and Christian members of extended families. Blah, 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 blah. You have people who choose Judaism because of its theology. And you have people who do not understand the Torah study and don't believe God. Like, it doesn't matter. It's okay that it's confusing, guys. No one cares. Right? What does it say? Early Americans commonly viewed Jews as a separate racial-like category. See, this is the lie. Early Americans, if they did, they were misinformed, because I just showed you how they were a mixed race. Early Americans commonly viewed, well, a lot of people view a lot of things commonly because of their minds being corrupted. Right? The nation of the Jews, who under every climate remain the same as far as fundamental configuration of faith goes, remarkable for a racial characteristic almost universal, which can be distinguished at the first glance. I mean, you want to talk about lying. The perception became far rarer after the Nazis' racially motivated Holocaust. As the United States grew more ethnically diverse, Jewish Americans increasingly were seen as white, as characterized that brought its own awkwardness and ambivalence. I'm going to talk about lying your butt off, guys. What did Hitler say? He said they looked white and European. Oh, there seem to be more white. Here, it's just so... There's so much... Yes, I'm white in the sense that as I walk around publicly, I have all the privileges allocated to a white woman. It says Karen. Her name is literally Karen Brockren, who recently wrote extensively on the subject of how Jews come to be considered white. Because there's a hell of a vicious history, but there's a hell of a vicious history of anti-Semitism. This is that whole, thing where, it's not white supremacy if you do it and saying you're Semitic, right? Don't be anti-Semitic. Well, what if I called you white? What if I called you a white Jew? Would you like that? No. Why? Why not? Because that would, if you say if the chosen race is a white Jew, then that would be too obvious. So just use the word Semite.
The rabbinate was quite split on the issue of emancipation of slaves. And so in one case, Morris Raphael in New York wrote a very famous piece, an editorial, where he defended slavery because, after all, the Bible endorses slavery, and the Bible actually sets out very clear parameters by which a Jew should own slaves, or how a Jew should own slaves.
See that? The Bible supports slavery. The Bible, guys, the Bible supports slavery. And he that stealeth the man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Yeah, but the rabbis told us the Bible endorses he that stealeth the man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. But the Bible endorses slavery. Okay. Right.
That was opposed by, he was more of the Orthodox, you may call, spectrum, or a supporter of like Isaac Leeser type of Judaism in America, whereas the Reform took a more progressive policy towards that. And so people like, I think his name was Bernard Felsenthal in Chicago, and famously David Einhorn, a Reform rabbi, who was a student, if I'm not mistaken, a student of Kaufman Kohler, or I may have it, actually I think I have it the other way around. Okay. Right, an important foundational figure in Reform Judaism in America. He was in Baltimore, and he avidly championed the cause of abolition. Yeah. He was actually run out of his own home in Baltimore. Wow. For doing that, because it was a slave supporting.
So all of the Reform progressive abolitionists would have been in the North or relatively close. We wouldn't be finding them in the South, right?
Well, theoretically, in the South there were positions. So let's say the furthest south maybe have been Cincinnati, where someone like Isaac Mayer Wise, a towering figure in American Jewry, took a kind of middle position where he wasn't willing to say that slavery was antithetical to Judaism, but found some shared cause. One thing that nobody was.
Notice. He wasn't willing to say that slavery was antithetical to Judaism. And so when you hear these people talking about let me show you the pictures of them marching with people marching with MLK and all this kind of stuff. Guys, of course, I mean, if you're going to say that you're the most hated group of people, I mean, I'm talking about the people who are pushing this narrative. You're gonna have to associate yourself with other people's struggles, right? And you're gonna have to say, well, we're here good, we're trying to help you. But you're not, what the thing you're not gonna do is you're not gonna say, okay, actually we helped own slaves, we were actually being racist too, we were, you're just gonna point out all the examples of the people who were helpful in that instance, right? Because overall you still get to say, well, but look, we're the most hated, right? And then when somebody says something like, I don't understand this or that, you just jump all over them, right? Because you're like, well, how do you understand that we're a race?
An abolitionist.
Oh, really?
What happened to the mixed race?
And that is because the abolitionism, the supporters of abolitionism in America had a very anti-Jewish rhetoric associated with their cause.
Even Quakers did?
Yeah, it's true. And William Lloyd Garrison also had said some.
I just want you to think about this. These guys are talking about people who claim to be Jews owning slaves in the North and the South, not going with the abolitionists, and they're saying the reason why they didn't go with the abolitionists is because people were being anti-Semitic, said some harsh things about the Jews, while they're owning slaves. And I don't know if that's missed on you. I just want you to think about that.
Quite hostile things towards the Jews. Wow. So you find that even rabbis like David Einhorn, who is probably the most supportive of emancipation, never really called himself an abolitionist.
So it wasn't a difference in values as much as sort of identity.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, interesting. Now, of course, there were Jews of color in Jamaica, and so how does the Jewish community in Jamaica, particularly Jewish slave owners, relate to Jews of color? Are they primarily Jews? Are they primarily people of color? Did Jewish white folks own Jewish people of color? So what did all that look like?
Yeah, so this is the $1 million question, right? Is what is the Jewish identity? How do you define it for mulatto Jews, as they're called in Suriname, or Jews of color, people with Jewish ancestry? Did they identify as Jews? Were they incorporated in the community? Were they incorporated into the family? Yeah. And it's hard to answer that question in Jamaica because there are no communal records. But there are communal records in Suriname. So this is what we know about Suriname, was that these Jews were part of the community. They were called mulatto Jews in the records. But they were not able to achieve the status of Yechidim. So they are Kangagansh, which were lesser status, where they were paying taxes to the community but couldn't receive communal honors. And in fact, there were moments when they had burial that was in somewhat of a less choice area of the cemetery in Yoden Savannah that led to an attempt of what probably was a learning academy, a yeshiva, called Barchi Yesharim of mulatto Jews, to try to maybe secede from the community or to assert an independence from the community. That was sort of an abortive attempt. That's because really a tax issue more than a racial issue, perhaps. It's hard to say. But what we can say is that they were buried in separate parts of the synagogue, separate parts of the cemetery. There were differentiations in their burial plots, and they had a clearly marginal status within the community. Yet they were totally identified as being Jewish.
Being Jewish wouldn't have been any street cred to avoid slavery, though, right?
You mean to avoid being enslaved?
Enslaved, yeah.
Not necessarily. Yeah. Right, not necessarily. It gives you some street cred, let's say, in Suriname, because at certain points in Surinamese history in the 18th century, especially into the 19th century, Jews become the dominant white group.
Oh, wow.
And so being associated with them ends up...
Notice he said Jews become the dominant white group. So he just grouped himself in with Jews become the dominant white group. So it makes sense. They're the dominant white group. They're in the North and South. They own slaves. They actually, some of them fought with Hitler. What the hell are we talking about here, guys? I mean, if you don't see the problems with this, and you still want to believe this stupidity of a chosen race, please just unsubscribe.
Giving you some status. So enough where you had your own confraternity, the Darchi Yesharim. So what we can say, though, communally, is that they definitely had a marginal status. Yet racial concerns were probably more important than halachic concerns. It doesn't really seem to come up. Like if their fathers were Jewish and their mothers were women of color, free or enslaved, did that mean that they had a Jewish identity, or there were efforts to convert them?
Right.
So I answer this question on a familial level, since I don't have communal records. And what I find in wills is you do have some cases when fathers, I would say, even try to coerce Judaism among their children of color. So they'll say, I give them this inheritance, I recognize these are my children. They'll say reputed children, or they'll say my natural children, so they'll qualify them in some way. And that's not necessarily because they're of color, but because they're not legally recognized. Because although there are no anti-miscegenation laws in Jamaica, people don't. It's socially anathema to marry women of color, so they don't have legal status. So they're called reputed children or natural children. And so in some rare cases, you'll see attempts to coerce their conversion. And in those cases, so I give you this inheritance only if they agree to learn in the academy and stay Jewish and have a Jewish identity. In which cases, they often separate them from their mothers, fearing that the influence of the mother may deter the efforts to incorporate them into Judaism. Other times it's more of a
That's kind of bogus. That's stupid. I'll give you this only if you separate from your mother. I'll give you this. Completely bogus, and that's how cruel can you be?
suggestion, or it's more inferred. In the cases where, let's say, the women, the mothers of these children are have taken names like Sarah, Israel. In one case that I find would suggest that she was a convert, and in those cases, the children all seem to have no distinction among other Jews. Their names are identical and things like that. They could be called Isaac Furtado. You would assume he's a Jew. You may not realize he's a Jew of color. And then there are cases when they clearly don't have a connection to the Jewish community. So I was able to follow up in just that way, taking all the wills with Jewish names. And then you would find some that were odd. But like there was, you find one that there's no oath on the 5 books of Moses, or they won't mention Christ, but they won't mention any Jewish institutions or anything. So it didn't quite look like the other Jewish wills. And in those, I was able to follow up and try to trace them back to earlier progenitors and find that they were often people of color. So in those cases, you find if you can follow them through the trail of wills, then you can see sometimes that they had no connection to the Jewish community over time. So I would say that it's always marginal. I'll give you one example. Right. Someone I read about a lot is, in fact, his house is the cover of my book because there's a painting of it. Yeah. And this is a Jew called Emmanuel Baruch Lutzad, who was part of a very wide network of Jewish families, all with the same name, that were scattered throughout Amsterdam and Suriname and in Barbados and in Jamaica, London. They were a huge pan-Atlantic Portuguese Jewish family. He was born in Jamaica, and he had 4 sons, and he mentions them in their wills for an inheritance without any distinction, including his son Aaron Baruch Lutzada. And later on, he includes what's called a codicil, so it's an amendment to a will where he says, even though he's just my reputed son, so first mentions him with no distinction among his brothers. Then later on, he has to amend it to say, okay, even though he's my reputed son, he still gets this inheritance, and if anybody challenges it, then they'll lose theirs. Wow. So clearly there was a tension associated with him being included in the family wealth in that way. And then when you read the will closer, you find that there was that the extra inheritance that he was going to get was a bequest made by his aunt. And so if you follow up her will, you find that she actually refers to this Jew of color, Aaron Baruch Lutzada, as her adopted son, suggesting that he had been raised apart from the Lutzada household, but in the other household, his aunt's household. So all of this suggests it's a contradictory story where he's completely included in the family, given inheritance with no distinction, given even extra inheritance that was given to him by his aunt, but raised apart from the family. And to make the story even trickier, he was probably buried in the cemetery because we have a tombstone with his name from 1808. Could be someone with the same name. That's very possible. But if it is him, it suggests that there was a level of communal inclusion. So all of that is to say that there isn't really one clear answer to what is the status of Jews of color in the Jewish community of Jamaica.
Okay, so my last question for you is is on how Jewish texts were used to justify this or that. You mentioned already that some use them to validate and justify slavery, being slave owners. But I wonder whether particular verses or concepts that were used in that you found in any of these other wills or sermons or the like.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's true among the rabbinate of North America around the time of the Civil War. That's when you start seeing, references to Genesis and to other, and to also even Mishneh Torah and texts that deal with the issue of slavery. What's amazing about Jamaica is that there seems to be zero interest in any of that, and that's probably true throughout the Caribbean. Even though in the Caribbean, unlike North America, there were Amsterdam-trained rabbis. And it's actually a very interesting parallel because I'll give you an example. Someone I've written about is the rabbi in Jamaica was trained at Chaim Yeshiva in Amsterdam, and his name was Joshua Zakai de Cordova. And his family, by the way, has a very long legacy in Jamaica. And to this very day, they were the printers of what is today the most widely circulated newspaper in Jamaica, the Daily Gleaner. So he was a very important part of Jamaican history, and Texas history, by the way, incidentally. And he wrote a lot, he published a lot while in Jamaica, where he doesn't deal with the issue of slavery at all, and or really very tangentially even deals with the question of people of color at all, and only ever just to put forth his claim of there being a universal revelation. That was his point. He was actually writing an anti-enlightenment treatise, but his point was that there was universal revelation, and there's no difference between human beings because we all have the same universal revelation. It's a very Mendelssohnian kind of position. His counterpart in Spanish Town at the same time, the head of the Anglican Church, was a reverend called John Lindsay, who was, we would call him an avid racist. In fact, he's been called a pro-slavery priest, and he was an advocate for an extremely unpopular position, even in the 18th century, which a type of ethnogenesis whereby, or it's called a polygenesis, whereby he rejects the story in the Bible where every human comes from the same progenitors, Adam and Eve, but rather people of color descend from other humans, so we're not all the same species. So this was actually, to us today, we think of this as being, well, that sounds like racialized thinking today, but in the 18th century it was even unpopular. And he was an avid advocate of that view, polygenesis, and in that sense he was trying to justify owning slaves, African slaves, because they were a lesser species. And so what's interesting is that you never see Joshua de Cordova, his counterpart. Both of them are very similar in so many ways, serving in the same place. They're both engaged in the trends of the European Enlightenment, yet one this doesn't touch this issue where one does radically. So that's just to say that there really is no remnant of any kind of intellectual justification for it. It was a lived experience whereby we live in a slave society, we own slaves, and that includes sexual ownership of them and exploitation of them, and all types of things that to us seem offensive, but was just part of their society, and they didn't look to the Bible or to Maimonides for justifications. Wow.
You just lied. They didn't look to the Bible or Maimonides for justification. That was a blatant lie, guys. We just saw the one guy said Maimonides. It's so funny, guys, to talk about revisionist history. They're like, how do I say Maimonides? From because Maimonides is quoted, he's one of their main sources. So it's like, how do we can't. What's this at? Here we go. Let's go here.
So they have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to Africa. So the Hemetic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade. Some years after the Babylonian Talmud, sometime in the Middle Ages, a man who I believe they consider to be perhaps one of the greatest philosophers ever, a man by the name of Maimonides, actually also contributed to that notion of Africans being subhuman when in his famous book, Guide to the Perplexed, when Maimonides suggested, again, that African people were less than human, that they were somewhere between monkeys and human beings. This is Maimonides, a man who is one of the most revered of all of these Jewish sages.
Man, people love to lie, man. People be lying their butts off, boy. Ooh, let's see, what else? I think that's gonna be it. What else is there? There was one more thing, guys. I think that's it. I'm gonna end it. It's gonna be very long. There was a video I was gonna show you of how Hitler played in with the Nazi thing. Hitler was very instrumental. The Pope. The Pope was very, very instrumental. Oh, so with the Pope and the instrumental, the Rothschilds are aligned with the Catholic Church, the Rothschilds. They loan money. So the Rothschilds have heavy influence even over the Catholic Church. So it just goes to show you, man, this stuff is so deep. And again, racism is made up as a social construct. So, if you don't want to be racist, don't practice racism. If you don't want to be racist, don't say you're a chosen race. See, you wouldn't feel like, everyone's blaming my race if you didn't identify yourself as being, quote unquote, on team race, team race code, team code race, you know? So that's how it happens. Okay. Thank you very much. See you.